So I've been reading this book recently, Don't Talk About Politics by Sarah Stein Lubrano. I think that's how you say it. And I got it from my local library, although I might buy it because I really enjoyed it. More on that later. But anyway, reading about this book made me think a lot about social media, more specifically about the recent discussions on the effects of social media on society, i.e. the potential harms of social media. I'll get to the book later, but first let me talk about social media. What is this whole argument about? Also, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. You know. Okay, so you don't need me to tell you that social media is a big deal. Unless you do, in which case, there you have it. Social media is a big deal. It's a pervasive, all-encompassing part of our lives. Naturally, this has led people of various backgrounds to ask, well, is social media having a major effect on our lives, whether it is sociological, psychological, economic, etc.? And is that effect good or bad? Basically, what price are we paying for having social media around? One side of the argument is that social media is bad, somehow dangerous, even bad for your health. Like, not cocaine and cigarettes bad, but I don't know, red meat and annoying in-laws bad. There's a spectrum, I suppose, and it's low on that spectrum, but it's there. And I would argue that for a lot of people, this is kind of intuitive. They sort of intuitively or generally know this or believe this. At least I think that's the case for my generation, millennials and older. I can't really speak for those Gen Z freaks. To make it about myself for a second, I don't really spend that much time on most social media. I somehow avoided that curse. But I do think that sometimes I spend too much time on sites like YouTube and certain parts of Reddit. And just by the language I use when I talk or think about this, too much time, that implies a value judgment. Deep down, I know that there's something wrong with that, or I believe that there's something wrong with that, even though I don't know exactly what that wrong is. And to be honest, I don't even know if I consider YouTube or Reddit to be social media. I mean, they're certainly not like Facebook or Twitter, but many people do, and that's kind of part of the challenge when talking about this, that we often tend to lump things together that are not necessarily the same, or that many people don't think of them as being the same thing. But that's a topic for a different time, so let's not dwell into that right now. Of course, the claims do get more specific the deeper you dive into this. For example, there are concerns that social media is highly addictive, that it's designed to be highly addictive, or that social media is rotting your brain, or that social media spreads misinformation, or that it's rewiring our brains, that contributes negative to mental health, it's causing depression, anxiety, loneliness, political polarization, etc., etc. You get the picture. And these are significant and often, more importantly, consequential public opinions. In 2025, Australia became the first country to ban social media for those under 16 years old, fueled precisely by such concerns. Other countries in Europe may be following suit. In the US, there are currently thousands of lawsuits by states and cities against social media companies accusing them of intentionally designing addictive products. I don't know if this whole debate started with Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, or if the book just tapped into something that was already there. But without question, it turned many people's attention to the relationship between social media and mental health. The book essentially makes the same arguments that I just talked about it just a minute ago, about the harms of social media, but focuses mostly on the younger generation, the youths, if you will. Except Haidt is quite strong in his assertions, putting most, if not all of the blame for the mental health crisis on social media. The book was, or still is, very popular. It was a bestseller and has been explicitly credited for inspiring the Australian social media ban and laws like it. Bestseller status aside, Haidt has received a lot of criticism from scientific experts in the field. Basically, the scientific evidence for most of his grandiose claims simply do not exist. Whatever scientific consensus that the book implies is not there. The strongest criticism of the book came from psychologist Candice Odgers, who wrote a scathing review in the Nature journals refuting most of the claims that Haidt makes. To be clear, Haidt is not fabricating data or making stuff up. He cites sources. However, as critics point out, he offers an overly simplistic view of the topic and fails to understand the complexity and limitations of the studies that he references, maybe with some cherry picking going on as well. My guess is that Haidt tried and failed to understand the science in a field that he's not an expert in which he's not an expert. in which he's not an expert, whatever. Perhaps, he started with a conclusion and sought to find evidence that supported that. This is not that uncommon. I've talked about it before. Even if you are a scientist, even if you are a very smart guy or whatever, which I'm sure Haidt is, trying to understand the scientific literature outside your own field, outside a field that you are an expert in, can be very challenging. There is context that you're missing, methodological subtleties that you just don't understand, or institutional knowledge that you may not be privy to, etc. There's nothing wrong with exploring other fields, but you must be careful not to fall into these traps. It's always better to consult actual experts in those fields. That's why collaboration is so important in science, because the disciplines are so specialized. The area of anyone's expertise is quite narrow. It's more of a pinpoint than an area, to be honest. Again, using my own experience as an example, even when I've had to work with things that are related to my own field, but perhaps slightly different, slightly adjacent, not quite my expertise, I've always had to consult and very likely collaborate with someone else. That's how it works. You ask around the department about something that you're interested in or you're having a problem with, and they say, oh, you should talk to that person. They know this thing very well. That's the guy to talk to. It takes years of hard work to become an expert in something. You can't just step into a field. Coincidentally, actually, a couple of days ago, I just got an email from a colleague asking for help on a project. We worked in the same lab. We should know most of the same things, but the small differences can go quite deep, and so does expertise. I do realize that this may be a little bit of an uncomfortable truth, as it does imply a sort of effective gatekeeping for knowledge or understanding, only accessible to a select few and whatever, but that's just simply the reality of the situation in this case. So to go back to Haidt, it's not that surprising that even with the best of intentions, he may have gotten a few things wrong. That's just the nature of the beast. Now, I want to be fair and give Haidt some credit. And I'm focusing on Haidt here because he wrote a very popular book. Obviously, it's not just him. I'm just using him as a placeholder for this whole side of the argument. Long story short, the science is simply not settled, and that goes both directions, because there's not nothing there. As much as I don't agree with Haidt's more grandiose claims in his book, based on the statement of experts, of course, he's also not making things up out of thin air. I understand that Haidt's book is tapping into a moral panic, or creating one, I'm not sure, with flimsy evidence at best, so I get the need for criticism, but I also don't think we should completely dismiss this topic. To paraphrase Odger's inherent nature critique of the book, we should appreciate the incredible complexity of this problem, so that means, in my opinion, that simplistic answers in either direction are probably not a good idea. Odgers herself, in her critique, does not completely dismiss the argument. While Haidt's book may be over-sensationalized and badly researched, she acknowledges that some reform of social media platforms may be advisable and highlights the need for further research on the topic. Actually, in some of her other publications, which I looked up in preparation for this video, she acknowledges that there are associations between social media and mental health, although she does make the case that these are inconsistent and not sufficiently strong to make overarching conclusions or policy decisions, which I agree with. If this effect exists, it is likely small and should be pretty low on our list of actionable priorities regarding this topic. More on that in a bit. You can easily explore this evidence yourself with the aforementioned caveats. You can go on PubMed or some other database and you can query for topics of social media and mental health, or depression, anxiety, well-being, etc. And you'll find plenty of papers on the subject, plenty of recent papers. These can be original studies, surveys, systematic reviews, meta-analysis, etc. And you'll find a wide variety of results. Many of these do show an association between social media and adverse mental health effects, including, very recent systematic reviews. Many also don't. All are from presumably experts in the field, published in reputable journals. So it's not quite nothing. There is something there, and it takes a lot of research, and a lot of research that's still to be done, to distinguish what may be real and what may be just the result of some confounding factor that we're just not accounting for yet. And to be honest, I read quite a few papers, and I thought maybe I would talk about some of them in detail, but the only thing that I really learned by reading a bunch of them is that there doesn't seem to be a clear consensus, or maybe the only consensus is that we just need to study these more. I think this issue highlights several problems about how science is communicated to the general public, and some of the fundamental misunderstanding that exists about the scientific method. And here, by general public, I mean anyone who is not a scientist, including people who make policy decisions that affect our lives. Obviously, the public does not get their science from scientific papers, for a lot of reasons. I've already talked about that. They get them through books like The Anxious Generation, although that may be somewhat optimistic, more likely from TikTok or your weird uncle's Facebook statuses. I already talked about the technical challenges of reading scientific articles, but aside from that, there is a stark difference in the language between these two worlds. The language used in the scientific literature is so careful and reserved and measured, mindful of the nuance that exists in our understanding of the topic. Unfortunately, that approach doesn't really sell books or get views on social media. By necessity, you kind of have to pep it up. Sometimes that is done in good faith, sometimes it is done in bad faith, or to be charitable, it is done carelessly. The other problem, and this is a much more abstract one, is that this approach somewhat divorces science from methodology and presents it not as a process, but as a collection of results, like a cloud of facts that you can just reach out and grab whatever result you need. But science is a process that changes and evolves over time, and that process is sometimes part of the result. How we came by the results, the larger context, the historical significance, etc., all are important, and it's all part of good, or what should be good scientific literacy, although admittedly that's a lot harder to communicate. I believe that this is true across the board, but I think that it becomes especially important as you go down the path from the natural to the more social sciences, such as psychology. The challenges that different scientific disciplines face is not the same, and this is somewhat lost from normal scientific communication. It's a completely different challenge to, say, observe the Higgs boson than to show that social media causes depression. It's kind of hard to articulate why this is the case, but I hope it's obvious what I mean. You can demonstrate that the Higgs boson exists beyond most reasonable doubt in ways that you could never do with a psychological study or anything to do with social sciences, I suppose. There are so many more layers of abstraction, so many more intractable variables that the standards of evidence are just different. The way you go about finding things is completely different. It's just a completely different level of complexity. In my research for this video, I found this very interesting paper that points out to some of the unique challenges that researchers in psychology face. The first one is that there is no overarching meta-theory. Unlike most physical sciences, there is no such thing in psychology. You just have a set of disparate and independent hypotheses used in different areas of research. There are artificial comorbidities. That means that in studies of mental disorders, they're often treated as distinct categories, but it doesn't necessarily work that way. To quote the article, clinical reality seldom adheres to these categories. Third, there is heterogeneity within diagnostic categories. That means that we can only talk about typical symptoms within a given condition, but there is a lot of variety. Depression, for example, can manifest differently in different individuals. There is the general ergoticity problem, which means that the population average, which is what studies often focus on, does not necessarily reflect the single person's average over time, which is known as the ergodic principle. And lastly, there is no to little insight into causal processes. That means that it's very hard to establish that X causes Y. It's mostly correlational studies. That's why something like, does social media cause depression or anxiety or XYZ is an incredibly hard question to answer in such a way that we never get a quote-unquote definitive answer. Here's the thing though, no matter what the answer is, I do think that there's something that we need to do, that we can do. This is not a wait and see situation. I guess it's a call to action of some sort, but it has nothing to do with social media. Well, not directly anyway. And this brings me back to the book that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, Don't Talk About Politics. See, I didn't forget about it. It all comes full circle. I'm not going to go over the book, you should read it, but basically it's about what influences our political thought and behavior. It's very well researched by a political scientist, I believe, and largely dispels common myths about the role of discourse, debate, and the so-called marketplace of ideas in the formation of our political beliefs. These are pointless, and I think we kind of know that by now. And instead, a lot of research in the last 60 years shows that it's other factors that play a much larger role in the creation of our beliefs and a lot of other areas of our life. And one of these factors, which is relevant today, that especially caught my attention is the role of social infrastructure. In the book, social infrastructure is defined a bit broadly as essentially any kind of infrastructure that brings people together. It's what helps get to know your neighbors, connect with people in meaningful ways. It's the shared spaces in our lives: schools, parks, playgrounds, religious institutions, community centers, public libraries, public transports even, etc. To quote from the book, "The value of these spaces is that they tend to broaden people's sense of who they belong with and who is part of their web of concerns. They tend to allow for the kind of deeper, open-ended conversations that help people overcome suspicion of one another and be open to new points of view. And in some cases, they may get people involved in new activities, whether that's football games with people of different ethnicities and cultures, activism, or simply a new style of parenting alongside other parents." Our social infrastructure has declined dramatically over the last 50 years, and the author of this book points to research that attributes many of our modern problems, our increased isolation, political polarization, to this decline of shared spaces or social infrastructure, and I would add mental health to that list as well. Basically, the more you isolate yourself, the more you become paranoid, conspiracy weirdo that doesn't care about other people. Moreover, it doesn't matter what your initial dispositions are, if these spaces exist, people will use them. We are social animals after all. That's what the research suggests anyway. Okay, so what does this have to do with social media? Well, basically, we are trying to replace our declining access to social infrastructure with social media, and it's not quite working out for us. So it's an alternative answer to the problem that Jonathan Haidt poses in the book. We are more understanding of each other when we occupy shared spaces, and so far, social media does not seem to be an adequate substitute for those physical shared spaces. I don't think the author of the book completely rejects the value of digital spaces, but research suggests that physical spaces are just much more effective at establishing that shared trust and community. The idea of social media as a digital town square simply does not have a lot of truth behind it. So going back to the topic of harm, whatever the problems with social media are, I think the whole conversation is just a distraction for the lack of shared spaces, the lack of social infrastructure. The lack of social infrastructure makes us flock into these poor alternative spaces, which in turn may be making us feel worse. We don't know, the jury's still out on that one. So instead of banning social media, which has dubious effectiveness, we should instead invest in social infrastructure and shared spaces. For one thing, you're never going to get people to give up their phones, but we can provide alternative spaces for people to gather and interact with each other in person. What's the saying? If you build it, they will come. People tend to like these things and society benefits from them.
If you book them, they will come.
Of course, this requires a lot of political power, but we measly peasants may be able to do something about it. You can get involved locally, you should get involved locally, and check out what your city council is doing. Ask for more of these social spaces and fight so that they're not defunded or privatized, which always seems to be about around the corner for some reason. Or at least you can complain about it. At least. In my city specifically, they reduced the hours of the public library because of funding cuts. What else could there be? And a lot of people complain about it because people like the library, especially parents with children. So they reduced it less than they planned to, so they reduced the reduction. But there were still reductions. And I would still like to change that. Maybe I'll send an angry email to my city council. I doubt that will do anything. But hey, if many people do it, who knows? Even on a much smaller scale, there's a lot you can do. You can get to know your neighbors, organize something in your area, join a local sports league, or if you're cool, join a local role-playing game league. Do things for your friends, make friends and hang out with them, or plant a tree, I don't know. Volunteer in your local area for whatever you think you might find enjoyable, maybe even your local library, who knows. If you check the website of your library, wherever you are, and again, I'm mostly speaking about the US here, I don't know how things work outside, but if you're in the US, you probably have a local library wherever you live. And if you check them out, I bet there's a bunch of events that they need volunteers for. Or, if you really want, you can even suggest your own event. I bet that if you go to the front desk of your library and say, hey, I like Magic the Gathering, I can host a tournament once a month for the local youths, or whatever, I'm sure they will accommodate you. They'll find something for you to do. Basically, do anything that increases your existence in a community where other people can have a small but measurable impact on your life, and you can do the same for them. I understand that this too may be overly simplistic. If you need to have 3 jobs to take care of your family, you don't really have time for this. You don't even have the time to think about having time for this. So I understand that. Again, there are no simple solutions, especially when economic and material conditions are unfavorable. Still, it's an important conversation to have. If you have time, it's something to think about. Get involved. All right, that's it for this video. I know it was a little bit all over the place, but I had fun making it, so I hope you enjoyed watching it. If I had to summarize my key takeaways, it would be 1, try not to fall in for moral panics. Seek out the opinion of experts instead. The world is complicated. Be skeptical of simple answers in either direction. 3, it's not about social media, it's about social infrastructure. And 4, hang out with your friends more. It's good for you. All right, that's it. Peace out.